This is the question that sits underneath every other question. Before you ask what's real, what's moral, what's true, you have to deal with this one first. Why does anything exist at all? Why isn't there just nothing? And it sounds simple, almost childish, the kind of thing a 5-year-old asks that makes you pause mid-sentence because you realize you don't have a good answer. But here's the thing, neither does anyone else. Not the physicists, not the theologians, and certainly not the philosophers, even though they've been wrestling with it for over 2,000 years. Leibniz is the one who really sharpened the blade on this. He argues that nothing in the universe contains the reason for its own existence. Everything you see, every atom, every star, every law of physics is contingent. It didn't have to be here.
So there must be something outside the whole system, something necessary, something that exists by its very nature and needs no explanation. He calls it a sufficient reason. And for Leibniz, that reason is God, a necessary being, the one thing that couldn't not exist. Clean argument, elegant even, but it doesn't hold up the way he wants it to. Because the obvious pushback is this: why does that necessary being exist? You've just moved the problem back one step. You haven't solved it. You've repackaged it. And if you say God simply exists by nature and doesn't need a reason, well, why can't the universe itself be that thing? Why can't brute existence just be the starting point? That's essentially what thinkers like Bertrand Russell argue. He calls the universe a brute fact. It's just here. No reason, no cause, no deeper explanation. You're asking a question that doesn't have an answer, not because we haven't found it, but because there isn't one to find. The question itself might be malformed. And that's a tough pill to swallow, because it feels like a cop-out. It feels like giving up. But Russell's not being lazy. He's being precise. He's pointing out that demanding a reason for everything is itself an assumption, a big one, and maybe reality doesn't owe us that. Now, existentialists take this somewhere even darker. Heidegger treats the question with almost religious seriousness. He argues that the very fact that we can ask this question, that we notice existence at all, is the most profound thing about being human. Most of philosophy, he claims, has forgotten this. It's gotten lost in categories and logic and systems, and it's completely overlooked the sheer strangeness of the fact that anything is here. He doesn't answer the question either, but he insists we sit with it, that the discomfort matters. And then there's the scientific angle: quantum mechanics, the Big Bang, multiverse theories. Some physicists argue the universe could have emerged from quantum fluctuations in a vacuum. But that's not nothing. A quantum vacuum is still something. It has laws, it has structure. You've just pushed the question further down the road again. So where does that leave us? Honestly, nowhere satisfying. Every answer either smuggles in an assumption or collapses under its own weight. The theist says God. The naturalist says brute fact. The physicist says quantum fields. And none of them can explain why that thing, their foundational thing, exists rather than nothing. That's what makes this question so relentless. It doesn't care about your framework. It sits beneath all of them, and it's not going away. Every decision you've ever made, every turning point, every moment you chose left instead of right, spoke instead of stayed silent, was any of it actually yours? That's not a rhetorical flourish. It's one of the oldest, most dangerous questions in philosophy. And after thousands of years of debate, nobody has a clean answer. The problem is deceptively simple. If the universe operates on cause and effect, and physics strongly suggests it does, then every event is the inevitable result of prior events. Your brain is part of that chain. Your thoughts, your impulses, your so-called choices, All of them are just dominoes falling in sequence. You didn't choose to read this. The prior state of the universe made it happen. That's hard determinism. And philosophers like Baron de Holbach argued it without flinching. He called free will a chimera, a comforting lie humans tell themselves because the alternative is unbearable. In his view, people are no different from rivers following gravity. You flow where the landscape forces you to flow, and the feeling that you're steering, that's just the river being unaware of the mountain. But here's where it gets uncomfortable. If determinism is true, then moral responsibility collapses. You can't praise someone for courage or condemn someone for cruelty. Not really. They couldn't have done otherwise. Every hero and every monster was just playing out a script written by physics before they were born. So, some philosophers tried to save free will without abandoning science. Compatibilists like David Hume and Daniel Dennett argue that free will doesn't require some magical escape from causation. It just requires that your actions flow from your own desires and reasoning, even if those desires were themselves caused by prior events. You're free, Hume suggests, as long as nobody's holding a gun to your head. The chains are there, but if you don't notice them, does it matter? Critics call that a cheat, and honestly, it's hard to disagree. Sam Harris, a neuroscientist turned philosopher, points out that compatibilism just redefines freedom so loosely that the word loses all meaning. He argues that if you can't control what you want, if your desires are handed to you by genetics, upbringing, and neurochemistry, then choosing based on your desires isn't freedom, it's just a more comfortable prison. And neuroscience has only made this worse. Benjamin Libet's famous experiments in the 1980s showed that brain activity associated with a decision fires before the person is even consciously aware of making it. Your brain decides, then it tells you. The conscious mind isn't the driver, it's the passenger who thinks it's steering. Libertarian free will, the idea that humans genuinely have uncaused choices, survives mostly in religious and metaphysical frameworks. Kant argued for it as a necessary assumption for morality to function, but he never demonstrated how it actually works inside a physical brain. It's a philosophical need, not an explanation. So where does that leave you? Stuck. If determinism is right, you're a puppet. If compatibilism is right, you're a puppet who's been told the strings are features, not bugs. And if libertarian free will is right, nobody can explain the mechanism. The real danger here isn't the philosophy, it's the implication. Courts, relationships, ambitions, guilt, pride, all of it is built on the assumption that people choose, that they could have done differently. And philosophy can't confirm that assumption. It can't deny it either. That's what makes this question so relentless. It doesn't just sit in textbooks, it sits underneath every single thing you do. Here's something most people never stop to think about. Every single cell in your body is on a replacement cycle. Your skin, your blood, your bones. Given enough time, almost every physical part of you gets swapped out for something new. So the body you're walking around in today, it's not the same body you had 7 years ago, not even close. And that raises a question philosophy has been wrestling with for centuries. If the physical material keeps changing, what exactly makes you you? John Locke had an answer. He argued it's memory. That personal identity isn't tied to your body at all. It's tied to the continuity of your consciousness. You are you because you remember being you yesterday. Your experiences, your recollections, that thread of awareness connecting your past to your present, that's the thing that holds your identity together. Sounds reasonable, clean, elegant even. But Thomas Reid saw the crack in it almost immediately. He laid out what's now called the brave officer paradox. A young boy gets punished. That boy grows into an officer who remembers the punishment. The officer becomes an old general who remembers being the officer.
but has completely forgotten the boy. So by Locke's logic, the general is the same person as the officer, and the officer is the same person as the boy. But the general is not the same person as the boy. That's a contradiction, and Reed knew it. Memory alone can't carry the weight of identity. It breaks down the moment you forget. David Hume went even further. He argued there is no self, not a permanent one anyway. He claimed that when he looked inward, when he tried to catch himself in the act of being a self, all he found was a bundle of perceptions, feelings, thoughts, sensations, all constantly shifting. There's no fixed entity underneath, no core, just a stream of experiences we stitch together and call a person. Hume essentially said identity is an illusion, a story the mind tells itself for convenience. And then there's Derek Parfit, who pushed this into territory that genuinely unsettles people. Parfit argued that what matters isn't identity at all, it's psychological continuity, your beliefs, your desires, your intentions. As long as there's a connected chain of those, it doesn't matter whether you technically survive. He used thought experiments involving teleportation and brain splitting to show that our obsession with personal identity might be completely misplaced, that we're asking the wrong question. He wasn't saying identity doesn't exist. He was saying it doesn't matter the way we think it does. But none of this is just abstract theorizing. This stuff has real consequences. If identity is tied to memory, what happens to Alzheimer's patients? Are they still the same person? If identity is psychological continuity, at what point does someone after a traumatic brain injury become a different person? And who has the right to decide that? And what about the future? If you could upload your consciousness into a machine, would that digital copy be you, or just something that thinks it's you? That's the problem. Every answer philosophy has offered so far either collapses under scrutiny or opens up a new set of questions just as difficult as the first. Locke's memory theory breaks. Hume's bundle theory dissolves the self entirely. Parfit's framework asks us to abandon the question altogether. And yet, you still feel like you. You feel like the same person who woke up this morning, the same person who existed last year. So what's holding that feeling together? Philosophy doesn't know, and that should bother you more than it does. This one cuts deep, and it's been cutting deep for centuries. Strip away religion, strip away scripture, strip away every divine command ever handed down from on high. What's left? Is there still a moral bedrock underneath it all? Or just preference? That's the question, and nobody's answered it. Plato took a swing at it early. In the Euthyphro, he asks something deceptively simple. Is something good because God commands it, or does God command it because it's good? And that question alone dismantles centuries of lazy thinking. Because if morality only exists because God says so, then it's arbitrary. God could have declared cruelty a virtue, and we'd all be expected to comply. But if God commands things because they're already good, then goodness exists independently of God, which means you don't need God for morality at all. Either way, the divine command theory takes a hit. So the secular philosophers stepped in. Kant argues that morality is grounded in reason, pure, cold, unflinching reason. His categorical imperative says, act only according to rules you'd want everyone to follow. No exceptions, no special treatment. It doesn't matter what you believe about God. Rationality alone gets you to moral law. And Kant's confident about this. He thinks moral truths are as real and as binding as mathematical truths. You don't need a deity to tell you that lying is wrong. You just need to think clearly. But here's the problem. Who decides what counts as rational? Cultures disagree. Individuals disagree. And reason, left to its own devices, has been used to justify everything from democracy to genocide. Rationality is a tool. It doesn't come preloaded with values. Then there's the utilitarian camp. Mill argues that morality is about outcomes. Maximize happiness, minimize suffering. Simple, elegant, no God required. But utilitarianism has its own ugly side. Push it far enough, and you can justify torturing one person if it makes 1,000 people happy. The math works, the morality doesn't. Or does it? That's the whole debate.
Nietzsche, predictably, blows the entire conversation apart. He declares God dead, not as a statement of atheism, but as a diagnosis. Western civilization built its moral framework on a religious foundation, and once that foundation crumbles, Nietzsche warns, the whole structure comes down with it. He doesn't celebrate this, he's terrified by it. Because without God, there's no guaranteed moral order, no cosmic referee, just humans, making it up as they go. And Nietzsche thinks most people aren't ready for that responsibility. He's probably right.
The moral realists push back. They argue that objective moral truths exist the same way mathematical truths exist, independent of human opinion, independent of God. Torture is wrong not because someone said so, but because it just is. But this raises an awkward question. Where do these truths live? What are they made of? You can't point to them, you can't measure them, you can't put wrongness under a microscope. So how do you know they're real? And the moral anti-realists, thinkers like Mackey, argue they're not. Mackey contends that moral facts are queer entities. They don't fit into any natural account of the world. Morality, he says, is a human invention. Useful, necessary even, but invented nonetheless. So where does that leave us? Stuck. Genuinely stuck. Because if morality is objective without God, no one's been able to prove it in a way that settles the debate. And if it's not objective, if it's just consensus, just convention, then every moral claim you've ever made is negotiable. Every single one. And that's not a comfortable place to be. Strip away your name, your job, your memories, your body. What's left? Is there even a you underneath all of that? Or is you just a word we paste over a bundle of constantly shifting parts? This isn't some abstract thought experiment. This is one of the oldest, most stubborn problems in all of philosophy, and no one's cracked it. The question goes back at least to Descartes. He's the one who draws the hard line. He argues that you are fundamentally a thinking thing, a mind, a soul, something entirely separate from your body. You could lose your arms, lose your eyes, lose every physical organ, and the thing that is you would still be there, untouched, because you aren't your body, you're the thing inside it. Sounds intuitive, but it falls apart fast. Because if the mind and the body are two completely different substances, how do they interact? How does a non-physical thought move a physical hand? Descartes never gives a satisfying answer to this. He gestures toward the pineal gland, which is almost embarrassing in hindsight. The interaction problem remains wide open, and it's been haunting dualism ever since. So the materialists step in. Thinkers like Daniel Dennett argue there is no ghost in the machine. You are your brain. Consciousness, identity, selfhood, all of it is just neurons firing in patterns. There's no soul hiding behind the curtain. There's no inner observer watching the show. The show is all there is. And this makes scientific sense. Damage the brain and the personality changes. Alter the chemistry and the emotions shift. Everything we associate with being someone seems to live in 3 pounds of gray tissue. So maybe that's all you are. But here's where it gets uncomfortable. If you're just a brain, just matter arranged in a certain way, then what exactly makes you different from a very complex machine? Where does this subjective experience come from? Why does it feel like something to be you? That's what philosopher David Chalmers calls the hard problem of consciousness.
And materialism doesn't have an answer for it. Not yet. Maybe not ever.
Then there's the continuity question. John Locke argues that personal identity is about memory. You are whoever remembers being you. If you can trace a continuous thread of memories from childhood to now, that's what makes you the same person. But that breaks down too. You don't remember being an infant. You've forgotten most of your life, actually. And people with severe amnesia don't stop being people. So memory can't be the whole story.
Derek Parfit pushes this even further. He argues that personal identity might not even matter. He presents thought experiments, teleportation, brain splitting, exact duplication, and asks, in those cases, who survives? His answer is unsettling. Maybe no one does. Maybe the question itself is confused. Maybe what we call identity is just a useful fiction we tell ourselves to get through the day.
And that's the real tension here. Every framework gives you something, but none of them give you everything. The dualist can't explain interaction. The materialist can't explain experience. The memory theorist can't account for forgetting. And the skeptic, like Parfit, says maybe the whole question is built on a mistake. So what exactly are you? After centuries of debate, we still don't know. And the harder you look, the more the answer seems to dissolve. You go searching for the self, and you find a pile of processes, perceptions, and patterns. But the thing you were looking for, the core, the essence, the you, keeps slipping through your fingers. You're aware right now. You know you're reading this. There's something it feels like to be you, a texture to your experience. A first-person reality that no one else can access. But what is that exactly? And why does it exist at all? This isn't just a hard question. Philosopher David Chalmers calls it the hard problem, capital H, capital P, because it's in a different category from every other scientific puzzle. We can map the brain. We can trace neurons firing, chemicals releasing, signals bouncing between regions. But none of that explains why any of it feels like anything. A machine can process information without experience. So why doesn't the brain just do its job in the dark? That's the gap. One immaterial. Consciousness belongs to the soul, not the brain.
Clean, elegant, and almost nobody in serious philosophy buys it anymore. Because if the mind is non-physical, how does it interact with the physical brain? How does a ghost move a muscle? Descartes never answered that. He just pointed at the pineal gland and moved on. Materialists took the opposite route. Daniel Dennett argues that consciousness isn't some mysterious extra ingredient. It's just what complex information processing looks like from the inside. There is no hard problem, he insists, just a collection of easier problems we haven't solved yet. Strip away the mysticism and you're left with neurons doing sophisticated work. Nothing more. But that answer leaves a lot of people cold, and not just philosophers. Because Dennett's framework essentially says your inner experience, the redness of red, the sting of grief, the warmth of sunlight on skin, is an illusion, or at best, a byproduct. And telling a conscious being that consciousness isn't real is a tough sell.
Thomas Nagel pushed back hard. His famous paper, What Is It Like to Be a Bat?, argues that subjective experience can't be reduced to objective physical facts. You can know everything about how a bat's sonar works, every neuron, every signal, but you will never know what it feels like to be a bat. That gap between third-person data and first-person experience isn't a gap science can close. It's a gap in the kind of knowledge science produces. And then there's the truly radical option, panpsychism. The idea that consciousness isn't something brains generate, but something fundamental to all matter. Philosophers like Giulio Tononi and Philip Goff argue that experience might be baked into the fabric of reality itself. Electrons have it, atoms have it, brains just have a lot more of it. It sounds absurd,
But the reason it's gaining traction is simple. Every other explanation has failed worse.
So here's the scorecard. Dualism can't explain interaction. Materialism can't explain experience. Panpsychism can't explain why certain arrangements of matter produce richer consciousness than others. Every framework solves one piece and breaks another. And the stakes aren't abstract. Consciousness is the foundation of moral consideration. It's why we care about suffering, why we grant rights, why we distinguish a person from a rock.
If we can't define it, we can't draw those lines with any confidence. And that matters more now than ever, because we're building machines that mimic intelligent behavior, and we have no way of knowing if anything's home inside them. The lights are on. Something is happening behind your eyes. Philosophy still can't tell you what. This is the one, the question that has started wars, built civilizations, torn families apart, and kept philosophers arguing for over 2,000 years. Does God exist? And after all that time, all that bloodshed, all that debate, philosophy still doesn't have a definitive answer. But it's not for lack of trying. Thomas Aquinas laid out what he called the 5 ways, 5 arguments for God's existence that became the backbone of classical theism. The most famous? The argument from motion. Everything that moves was set in motion by something else. But you can't have an infinite chain of movers, so there must be a first mover, something that started it all without being started itself. And that, Aquinas argued, is what everyone calls God. It's clean, it's logical, and for centuries it was considered nearly airtight. But David Hume dismantled it. He pointed out that just because everything we observe seems to have a cause, doesn't mean the universe itself needs one. That's a leap, a big one. Hume argued that our idea of causation is just a habit of the mind. We see one thing follow another and assume a connection, but assumption isn't proof. And you can't use patterns observed inside the universe to make claims about what's outside it. Then there's the ontological argument, arguably the most abstract attempt ever made. Anselm of Canterbury proposed that God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. And if something exists only in the mind, you could always conceive of something greater, something that also exists in reality. So God must exist, by definition. Immanuel Kant wasn't buying it. He argued that existence isn't a property you can just add to a concept to make it more great. Saying God exists doesn't add anything to the concept of God. It just says the concept has a real-world counterpart, and you can't argue something into existence through definition alone. Kant essentially said the ontological argument is a clever trick, nothing more. And then there's the problem of evil, the argument that has probably shaken more believers than any philosophical text ever written. Epicurus framed it centuries ago. If God is willing to prevent evil, but unable, he's not omnipotent. If he's able but unwilling, he's not benevolent. If he's both able and willing, then where does evil come from? And if he's neither able nor willing, why call him God at all? Leibniz tried to respond. He argued that this is the best of all possible worlds, that some evil is necessary for a greater good we might not fully understand. But Voltaire savaged that idea in Candide, pointing to real human suffering and asking whether any divine plan could justify it. The response didn't hold, not for most people, not when you look at the world honestly. So where does that leave us? The believers haven't proven God exists, not in a way that survives philosophical scrutiny. And the skeptics haven't proven God doesn't exist, because you can't definitively prove a negative of that scale. Aquinas builds a case, Hume tears it down. Anselm constructs a proof, Kant dismantles it. Epicurus raises a challenge, and Leibniz's answer feels more like a cope than a resolution. And that's the uncomfortable truth. After thousands of years, the most debated question in all of human thought remains exactly where it started, open, unresolved, hanging in the air like it's waiting for something philosophy alone might never be able to give it, an answer.
This used to be a stoner thought experiment. Now it's a legitimate philosophical problem, and that should unsettle you. The argument is straightforward. Bostrom lays it out in 2003 with surgical precision. He doesn't claim we live in a simulation. He's more careful than that. What he argues is that one of three things must be true. Either civilizations destroy themselves before they ever develop the computing power to simulate reality, or they develop the power but choose not to use it. Or, and here's the one that keeps people up at night, we are almost certainly living in a simulation right now.
The logic is disturbingly clean. If a civilization can simulate conscious beings, it'll probably run millions of those simulations, which means simulated minds vastly outnumber real ones. And if you're picking a mind at random, the odds say you're simulated, not real. A line of code that thinks it's a person. Descartes saw this coming, sort of. 3 centuries before Bostrom, he races the possibility that an evil demon could be feeding us a fake reality. Every sight, every sound, every sensation, all manufactured.
And Descartes' solution, I think, therefore I am. The one thing you can't fake is the act of thinking itself. But that's a thin lifeline, because even if you're thinking, you still don't know what you're thinking inside of. A simulation? A brain in a vat? A demon's playground? Descartes gives you existence. He doesn't give you reality. And here's where it gets philosophically vicious. Kant argues that we never experience reality as it truly is. We experience it through the filters of our own minds. Space, time, causality, these aren't features of the world, they're features of us. Which means even without a simulation, you're already trapped behind a screen. Your perception is the screen. So if someone tells you the world is simulated, Kant's response might just be, what difference does it make? You were never touching raw reality to begin with.
But some philosophers think it matters enormously. Nozick's experience machine thought experiment makes this case. He asks, if you could plug into a machine that gives you a perfect, blissful, entirely fake life, would you do it? Most people say no, and the reason is telling. People don't just want to feel like they're living a good life. They want to actually be living one. There's something about authenticity, about contact with the real, that humans crave at a fundamental level. So if we are in a simulation, that craving goes permanently unsatisfied. Every achievement, every relationship, every moment of meaning, all running on someone else's hardware. But the pragmatists shrug, and honestly, their case isn't weak. If the simulation is indistinguishable from reality, if you can't tell the difference, can't break out, can't peek behind the curtain, then functionally, it is your reality. The pain is real to you. The joy is real to you. The moral weight of your choices doesn't evaporate because the substrate is silicon instead of space-time. And yet, something nags, because the simulation hypothesis doesn't just ask what is real, it asks whether the question even has an answer, and it asks who's running the thing. What are their motives? Can they shut it off? Are they watching? That's not physics anymore. That's theology wearing a lab coat. We traded God for a programmer, and we're no closer to the truth. The unsettling part isn't that we might be simulated, it's that we have no way, none, to rule it out. And every tool we'd use to investigate is part of the system we're trying to investigate. You can't debug the program from inside the program. You'd think after thousands of years of moral philosophy, we'd have this figured out. We don't.
Not even close. The question of what makes an action right or wrong is one of the most fought-over, unresolved battlegrounds in the entire history of human thought. And every answer, every single one, has a fatal crack in it. Start with the most influential framework, utilitarianism. Jeremy Bentham lays the groundwork. John Stuart Mill refines it. The idea is simple. An action is right if it produces the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Pleasure good, pain bad. Do the math. Maximize the outcome. And on the surface, it works. It's clean, it's logical, it gives you a formula. But the moment you push on it, it starts to buckle. Because utilitarianism has no problem sacrificing one person for the benefit of many. If harvesting one innocent person's organs saves 5 lives, the math says do it. And most people recoil at that. Something in us screams that's wrong, even if the numbers add up. So that's the cost of consequentialism. Kant sees this problem and goes the other direction entirely. He argues that morality has nothing to do with outcomes. What matters is the principle behind the action. His categorical imperative says, act only according to rules you could will to be universal laws. Don't lie, not because lying leads to bad consequences, but because if everyone lied, the very concept of truth collapses. Morality for Kant is about duty, pure, unconditional duty. But Kant's system is rigid to the point of absurdity. He argues you should never lie, even if a murderer comes to your door asking where your friend is hiding. Follow the rule, tell the truth, let the consequences fall where they may. And that's not moral clarity, that's moral paralysis dressed up as principle. Then you've got virtue ethics, going all the way back to Aristotle. He argues that morality isn't about rules or outcomes, it's about character. A good action is whatever a virtuous person would do. Cultivate courage, temperance, justice, wisdom, and the right choices will follow naturally. It's an appealing idea, but it's also dangerously vague. Who decides what counts as virtuous? Aristotle thought slavery was natural. He thought women were intellectually inferior. His virtuous person was a wealthy Greek man. So, virtue ethics gives you a compass, but the compass is calibrated by culture, and cultures get things horrifyingly wrong. And then there's the deeper challenge, moral relativism. Some thinkers argue there is no objective right or wrong at all. Morality is just a social construct. What's right in one culture is an abomination in another. And who are you to say your framework is the correct one? But relativism has its own trap. If morality is entirely relative, then you can't condemn anything. Genocide isn't wrong, it's just frowned upon in certain societies. And that conclusion is so repulsive that most people abandon relativism the moment they follow it to its logical end. So here we are. The utilitarian says maximize happiness, but justifies monstrous trade-offs. The deontologist says follow the rules, but can't bend when reality demands it. The virtue ethicist says be good, but can't clearly define what good means. And the relativist says it's all subjective, but can't look human suffering in the eye and hold that line. Every framework illuminates something real, and every framework collapses somewhere. That's the problem. Morality feels absolute. It feels like it should have a foundation, but every time we dig for one, we hit sand. Here's a thought experiment that's been haunting philosophy for over 2,000 years. You have a ship. Over time, every single plank, nail, and rope gets replaced, one piece at a time, until nothing original remains. Is it still the same ship? Plutarch recorded this puzzle, and it sounds like a quaint little riddle until you realize it's not about ships at all, it's about you. Your body replaces its cells constantly. Your skin, your blood, your gut lining, most of it is newer than your oldest pair of jeans. Your atoms cycle in and out like tenants in a cheap apartment. The matter that made up you 10 years ago is scattered across the planet by now. So what exactly is persisting? What makes you the same person who existed a decade ago? John Locke had an answer. He argued that personal identity isn't about the body. It's about memory and psychological continuity. You're the same person because you remember being that person. Your consciousness threads through time like a string through beads. Cut the string, lose the memories, and the identity dissolves. The body is irrelevant. The mind is what matters. But that opens a nasty trapdoor. What about memories you've forgotten? Are you not the same person who lived through events you can't recall? What about false memories, things you were certain happened but didn't? Locke's framework makes identity fragile, too fragile. One case of amnesia and personhood just evaporates. David Hume went further and darker. He argued that there is no self at all. Look inward, he says, and what do you actually find? A stream of perceptions, sensations, thoughts, feelings, but no permanent you sitting behind them, watching. The self is a fiction, a story the mind tells to stitch together a chaotic flood of experience into something that feels coherent. You don't have an identity, you have a habit. That's not comfortable, but it's hard to refute on purely empirical grounds. Because Hume's right, you can't point to the self, you can't isolate it. You experience things, but you never experience the experiencer. But here's the problem with denying the self entirely. Society doesn't function without it. Legal responsibility, promises, relationships, punishment, reward, all of it assumes a continuous person who persists through time. If you're not the same person who signed that contract 5 years ago, why should you honor it? If identity is an illusion, then guilt is meaningless, and so is love. Derek Parfit tackled this head-on. He argued that identity doesn't matter the way we think it does. What matters is psychological continuity, overlapping chains of memory, intention, and character. Not perfect sameness, just enough connection. And he was willing to accept the consequences, that identity is a matter of degree, not an all-or-nothing fact. You're not identical to your past self, you're just closely related. That's elegant, but it still doesn't tell you where one person ends and another begins. And that boundary, the line between self and not self, is something every moral and legal system on Earth depends on. The ship keeps sailing, the planks keep changing, and nobody can tell you if it's the same ship, or if it ever was. This one cuts deep, not because it's abstract, but because everyone's felt it. You've watched someone decent, someone kind, someone who did everything right get destroyed by something they didn't deserve. A diagnosis, a disaster, a betrayal that came out of nowhere. And the question hits you like a wall. Why them? Philosophy has been circling this question for millennia, and it still hasn't landed. The Stoics had a framework. Epictetus argued that nothing external is inherently good or bad. It's our judgment of events that creates suffering. A hurricane isn't evil. A disease isn't malicious. These things simply are. Marcus Aurelius echoed this. He insisted that the universe operates according to a rational order, and what looks like injustice to us is just a failure of perspective. We're too small to see the full picture. The Stoic answer, essentially, is that the question itself is flawed. Bad things don't happen to good people, because bad is a label we impose, not a feature of reality. But that answer has never satisfied most people. And honestly, it shouldn't. Because telling a parent who just buried their child that suffering is a matter of perspective isn't philosophy, it's cruelty dressed up in logic. The religious traditions tried harder. and struggled just as much. The book of Job is arguably the oldest sustained meditation on this problem. Job is righteous, genuinely righteous, and God allows everything to be stripped from him: his wealth, his children, his health.
His friends insist he must have sinned, he must deserve it, but Job refuses that explanation. And when God finally responds, he doesn't give an answer. He essentially says, "You can't comprehend my reasons," which isn't a resolution, it's a deflection, a divine "because I said so."
Leibniz again stepped in with his theodicy, the idea that God permits suffering because it serves a greater cosmic good, that evil is a necessary ingredient in the best possible world. But Dostoevsky pushed back with devastating force. In The Brothers Karamazov, Ivan Karamazov asks a simple question: if eternal harmony requires the suffering of even one innocent child, is it worth the price? And his answer is no. No amount of future good justifies present horror. That's not pessimism, that's moral clarity. The secular philosophers didn't solve it either. Albert Camus argued that the universe is fundamentally indifferent. It doesn't care about fairness. It doesn't care about justice. It doesn't care about you. Suffering isn't a punishment, and it isn't a lesson. It's just what happens when fragile beings exist in a universe that owes them nothing. Camus called this the absurd, the collision between our desperate need for meaning and a world that refuses to provide any. And that's the real tension. Every framework either tells you suffering has a hidden purpose you can't see, or tells you it has no purpose at all. One asks you to trust a plan you'll never understand. The other asks you to keep going anyway, knowing there's no plan to begin with.
Neither is comforting, and maybe that's the point, because this question doesn't really want a philosophical answer. It wants justice. It wants someone to say the universe keeps a ledger, that goodness is rewarded and cruelty is punished. But philosophy can't say that, not honestly.
The Stoics reframe it. Religion defers it. Existentialism accepts it. And the question remains, sitting right where it's always been, unanswered. Not because philosophers haven't tried, but because the universe doesn't seem to operate on the terms we wish it did.
You feel it passing every single day. You watch clocks, set alarms, miss deadlines. Time seems like the most obvious thing in the universe. But ask a philosopher what time actually is, and watch the confidence drain from the room, because nobody knows. Not really.
McTaggart drops a bomb in 1908 that philosophy still hasn't recovered from. He argues that time is unreal. Not metaphorically, not poetically, literally unreal. His reasoning goes like this. We think of events as past, present, and future, what he calls the A series. But every event occupies all three positions. Your birth was once future, then present, now past. So which is it? It's all of them.
And that, McTaggart insists, is a contradiction. A thing can't be past and present and future simultaneously. So the A series is incoherent, and without it, time collapses. Philosophers have been trying to put it back together ever since. Most of them haven't succeeded.
Kant takes a different route entirely. He argues that time isn't a feature of the external world at all. It's a feature of the mind, a built-in lens through which humans organize experience. Without a mind to perceive it, there is no time. The universe doesn't tick, we tick, and we project that ticking onto everything we observe. Time, for Kant, is as much a human construction as language or mathematics, real in function, but not real in substance. And that's a deeply uncomfortable idea, because it means the thing you're most afraid of losing, time, might not be something you ever had. The physicists don't make it easier. Einstein demonstrates that time is relative. It bends, it stretches. It moves differently depending on speed and gravity.
Two people can experience genuinely different durations of the same event. So whose time is the real one? Neither. Both. The question stops making sense once you accept relativity. And the block universe theory, favored by many physicists, suggests that past, present, and future all exist simultaneously. There's no flow, no passage, just a four-dimensional block where everything that ever was and ever will be simply is. You're not moving through time, you're frozen in it.
Heidegger pushes back from a completely different direction. He argues that time isn't some abstract thing to be measured. It's the very structure of human existence. Being, for Heidegger, is fundamentally temporal. We are creatures who project ourselves into the future, carry the weight of the past, and exist in the tension of the present. Remove time, and you don't just lose clocks, you lose us, you lose meaning, you lose the possibility of caring about anything at all.
So for Heidegger, the question isn't whether time is real, it's that time is more real than we are. We're made of it. But here's the knot nobody can untangle. If time is a construction of the mind, then what was happening before minds existed? Did billions of years of cosmic history unfold in no time at all? And if time is real, genuinely, independently real, then why can't physics find a single, universal now? Why does the present moment keep slipping away the harder you try to pin it down?
Augustine puts it best, and he puts it honestly. He says he knows what time is until someone asks him to explain it. And that's not a failure of intelligence. That's the nature of the problem. Time is so close to us, so woven into every thought and perception, that stepping outside it to examine it objectively might be impossible. You can't study the water while you're drowning in it. And philosophy, on this one, is still drowning. Every philosopher who's ever lived has had to face this one, not as an abstract puzzle, not as a thought experiment, as a deadline, the only deadline that actually matters. And here's what's strange. After thousands of years of the sharpest minds in human history wrestling with this question, we're no closer to an answer than the first person who ever watched someone stop breathing and wondered, where did they go?
Epicurus tried to settle it early. His argument was clean, almost surgical. Death is the end of sensation. When you exist, death doesn't. When death exists, you don't. So there's nothing to fear. It's not a doorway, it's not a transition. It's just nothing. And nothing, by definition, can't hurt you.
He wasn't being poetic about it. He was being logical. But logic doesn't always land when you're staring at a coffin. Plato took the opposite route entirely. He argues the soul is immortal. The body is a cage, temporary, decaying, irrelevant. Death isn't destruction, it's liberation. The soul finally gets to return to the realm of forms, to pure knowledge, to truth uncorrupted by flesh and appetite. And he doesn't just assert this. In the Phaedo, Socrates lays out multiple arguments: the argument from recollection, the argument from opposites, the affinity argument, all designed to prove that the soul doesn't just survive death, it was never really born to begin with. Bold, elegant, but provable? Not even close. And that's the fracture that runs through every philosophical attempt to answer this question. You either land on annihilation or continuation. There's no middle ground. Either consciousness dissolves into nothing, or it persists in some form we can't verify. Both positions demand faith, one in oblivion, the other in something beyond it. The existentialist didn't dodge this. Heidegger makes death central to his entire framework. He argues that human existence is fundamentally shaped by its own finitude. He calls it being toward death, not as something morbid, as something clarifying. The awareness that you will die, that it's coming, that it's yours alone, that no one can do it for you, that awareness is what forces authenticity. Without it, you drift, you follow the crowd, you live someone else's life. So for Heidegger, the question isn't really what happens after death, it's what death does to you while you're still alive. But Camus pushes even further. He strips away the comfort entirely. He argues the universe is indifferent. There's no meaning waiting on the other side. There might not even be another side. And the real philosophical problem isn't death. It's whether life is worth living in the face of that absurdity. That's his starting point in the myth of Sisyphus. Not heaven, not reincarnation, just the raw question of whether any of it matters at all. So where does that leave us? Religion offers answers, detailed ones, comforting ones. But philosophy? Philosophy keeps circling the question without ever landing. And maybe that's the honest thing to do, because the truth is, no one has come back with a report. No one has crossed that line and returned with data. Every claim about what lies beyond death is, at best, an inference. At worst, a wish dressed up as an argument. And that's what makes this question different from every other one on this list. It's not just unanswered. It might be unanswerable. Not because we lack the intelligence, but because we lack the access. The one experience that would give us the answer is the one experience that makes answering impossible. Philosophy can prepare you for death. It can reframe it. It can challenge your fear of it. But tell you what happens after, that's the one door it can't open. This one's been haunting theology and philosophy for over 2,000 years, and nobody, not a single thinker in the history of human thought, has put it to rest. The question is brutally simple. If God is all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good, why does suffering exist? Why does a child get cancer? Why do earthquakes flatten entire cities? Why does cruelty go unpunished, while innocence gets destroyed? Epicurus laid the trap first, or at least the version attributed to him did. He frames it as a logical trilemma. If God wants to prevent evil but can't, he's not omnipotent. If he can prevent it but won't, he's not benevolent. And if he both can and wants to, then where does evil come from? There's no clean exit from that box. Every door leads to a problem. Theologians have tried. Oh, they've tried hard.
Augustine of Hippo argues that evil isn't a thing in itself. It's an absence, a privation of good. Like darkness is just the absence of light. Evil exists because free beings chose to turn away from God. It's not God's creation, it's humanity's failure. But here's the issue. That argument only covers moral evil, human cruelty. It doesn't explain why a tsunami kills 200,000 people who never made a free choice to suffer. It doesn't explain why a newborn dies of a genetic disease before it ever takes a conscious breath. And that distinction matters. Philosophers split evil into two categories for a reason. Moral evil, the kind humans inflict on each other, and natural evil, the suffering built into the fabric of the world itself. Earthquakes, plagues, famine. No human hand caused those, so who's responsible? Leibniz takes a different route. He argues this is the best of all possible worlds. God, being perfect, would only create the optimal universe, one where some suffering is necessary for a greater good we can't fully comprehend. Voltaire tears that apart in Candide. He watches the Lisbon earthquake of 1755 kill tens of thousands and essentially asks, best possible world? This one? The satire is devastating because it doesn't need to construct a philosophical argument. It just points at reality. Alvin Plantinga, centuries later, offers what's become the most discussed modern defense.
His free will defense argues that a world with genuine free will, even one where people choose evil, is more valuable than a world of programmed goodness. God couldn't create free beings and simultaneously guarantee they'd never do wrong. That's a logical contradiction, not a failure of power. But again, this handles moral evil. It says nothing about the earthquake, the cancer, the flood. Some thinkers abandon the framework entirely. David Hume argues the problem of evil isn't just a puzzle, it's evidence. Evidence that the traditional concept of God is incoherent. He doesn't say God doesn't exist. He says the God described by classical theism, omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent, doesn't match the world we actually live in. Something in that description has to give. And that's where it stands. Thousands of years later, the problem hasn't been solved. It's been reframed, repackaged, responded to, but never resolved. Every theodicy raises new objections. Every defense covers one flank and leaves another exposed. The suffering is real. The silence from the heavens is real. And the gap between a supposedly perfect creator and a visibly imperfect creation, that gap remains the single most corrosive challenge to religious philosophy ever posed. No one's closed it, and it's worth asking, honestly, whether anyone ever can. Here's a question that should terrify you. Do you actually make choices, or do you just think you do? Because if the determinists are right, every decision you've ever made was already decided. Before you were born, before your parents were born, before this planet even existed. The atoms that make up your brain were set on a path billions of years ago. And every thought, every impulse, every so-called choice you've ever made, just dominoes falling in a chain that started at the Big Bang. That's not poetry, that's physics. The hard determinists, thinkers like Baron Dolbach and more recently, neuroscientist Sam Harris, argue exactly this. Dolbach puts it bluntly, man is a machine. A sophisticated one, sure, but a machine nonetheless. Harris pushes it further. He points to neuroscience experiments, the famous Libet studies, where brain activity shows a decision has been made seconds before the person is even aware of making it. You didn't choose. Your brain chose. You just got the memo late. And that raises a brutal follow-up question. If free will is an illusion, what happens to morality? What happens to justice? You can't punish someone for something they couldn't help doing. You can't praise someone for a virtue they didn't actually choose. The entire framework of human responsibility just collapses. But not everyone accepts this. The libertarians, and no, not the political kind, philosophers like Robert Caine argue that genuine free will exists. Caine insists that at critical moments, the will is genuinely undetermined. There are real forks in the road, and humans actually pick a direction. He calls these self-forming actions, moments where the outcome isn't pre-written, where you are, in fact, the author. It's a bold claim, and it's hard to prove. So a third camp steps in, the compatibilists, thinkers like Daniel Dennett and, centuries earlier, David Hume. They argue the whole debate is based on a false dilemma. Free will and determinism aren't enemies. They can coexist. Dennett argues that free will doesn't require some magical escape from causation. It just requires that your actions flow from your own desires, your own reasoning, without external coercion. You're free, not because you're uncaused, but because you're the cause. Hume makes a similar move. He argues that free will simply means acting according to your own will, not being forced by someone else. The opposite of freedom isn't determinism, it's compulsion. Sounds reasonable, but the hard determinists fire back. They say compatibilism is a cop-out, a word game. You're still a puppet. You're just a puppet that enjoys the strings. And here's where it gets really uncomfortable. Neuroscience keeps piling on evidence. Brain scans, predictive algorithms, studies on unconscious decision-making, all pointing in the same direction. The conscious mind might just be a spectator, watching a show it thinks it's directing. Philosophers like Dirk Pereboom takes this seriously. He argues for what he calls hard incompatibilism, the view that free will is incompatible with both determinism and indeterminism, meaning no matter how the universe works, you're still not truly free. But Pereboom doesn't despair. He argues we can build a functioning moral system without free will, one based on rehabilitation, not retribution. So where does that leave us? Honestly, stuck. Philosophy hasn't settled this. Science hasn't either. And maybe that's the most unsettling part. You'll go through your entire life making what feel like choices, building an identity around them, defending them, regretting them, and you may never know if any of it was actually up to you. This is the question that refuses to die. Every generation asks it. Every philosopher takes a swing at it, and not a single one has landed a knockout blow. Here's the problem. Humans don't just want to survive. They want to know why they're surviving. What's the point? What's the endgame? And philosophy has been wrestling with that for over 2,000 years, with no consensus in sight. The ancient Greeks didn't shy away from it. Aristotle argues that the meaning of life is eudaimonia, a word we lazily translate as happiness, but that's not what he meant. He's talking about flourishing, living in accordance with virtue, fulfilling your function as a rational being. For Aristotle, meaning isn't something you find. It's something you build through excellent action, day after day. But here's the catch. His framework assumes humans have a fixed nature, a purpose baked into the design, and that assumption is far from settled. The existentialists blow the whole thing wide open. Sartre declares that existence precedes essence. There is no pre-written script, no cosmic blueprint. You're thrown into the world with no instructions, no manual, no mission statement, and that terrifies people. Sartre doesn't care. He argues that meaning is entirely self-created. You choose it. You own it. You bear the full weight of that choice. Freedom, in his view, isn't a gift. It's a burden most people spend their lives running from. Camus takes it even further. He argues the universe is fundamentally indifferent. It doesn't care about your search for meaning. It won't answer your questions. And the gap between humanity's desperate need for purpose and the universe's cold silence, that's what he calls the absurd. But Camus doesn't tell you to give up. He tells you to keep going anyway, to rebel against meaninglessness by living fully, even without answers. His image of Sisyphus, endlessly pushing a boulder uphill, isn't a tragedy, it's a model. One must imagine Sisyphus happy, he writes, not because the task has meaning, but because the defiance itself becomes the meaning. Nietzsche attacks the question from a completely different angle. He argues that the very search for a single, universal meaning is a symptom of weakness. It's a desire to be told what to do, to have someone, God, nature, society, hand you a purpose on a silver platter. Nietzsche rejects that. He insists that meaning must be forged through the will to power, not domination over others, but mastery over oneself, the creation of values, not the passive acceptance of inherited ones. It's a brutal demand, and most people, he warns, aren't up for it. Then there's the religious dimension. Centuries of theological thought, from Aquinas to Kierkegaard, argue that meaning is inseparable from the divine. Aquinas holds that humanity's ultimate purpose is union with God. Kierkegaard goes deeper. He argues that meaning can't be reached through reason at all. It requires a leap of faith. an irrational, terrifying plunge into belief without guarantees. Rational philosophy, in his view, will always fall short. So where does that leave us? Nowhere clean, nowhere comfortable. Every answer generates new objections. Every framework has a crack in it. And that's precisely the point. This isn't a question philosophy has failed to answer. It's a question philosophy has revealed to be far more dangerous than most people assume. Because the moment you take it seriously, really seriously, you can't go back to living on autopilot. The question isn't just unanswered, it's unanswerable. And that might be the most honest thing philosophy has ever admitted. This one cuts deep because we all use the word. We throw it around like it's obvious, like everyone knows what it means. A dictator commits genocide. Evil. A man tortures a child. Evil. But the moment you try to pin down what evil actually is, the ground shifts under your feet. Is evil something real? Something built into the fabric of the universe? Or is it just a label we slap on things that disgust us? Moral realists say yes, evil is a fact. It exists independently of what anyone thinks or feels about it. Some acts are objectively wrong. Not wrong because society disapproves. Not wrong because it makes you uncomfortable. Wrong in the same way gravity is real, whether you believe in it or not. Plato leans into this. He argues there's a form of the good, an absolute, unchanging standard. And evil is the deviation from it, the absence of it. Not a force in itself, but a falling short of what ought to be. That raises a problem, a big one. If evil is objective, where does it come from? Who wrote the rule? And how do we access it without dragging in religion or metaphysics? The moral relativists have a sharper answer. They argue evil is a construction, a human invention. What counts as evil in one culture is perfectly acceptable in another. Nietzsche makes this point with a sledgehammer. He argues that what we call evil is often just the powerful being judged by the weak. In On the Genealogy of Morals, he traces the entire concept back to what he calls slave morality, the resentment of the powerless rebranded as virtue. The meek didn't inherit the earth. They just convinced everyone that strength was sinful. So evil isn't a discovery, it's a strategy. And that's uncomfortable, because if Nietzsche's right, then evil isn't a fact about the world, it's a fact about power dynamics, about who gets to define the terms. Kant tries to hold the middle. He argues that evil is real, but it's rooted in human will, not in some cosmic ledger. For Kant, moral law is rational, it's universal, and evil is the deliberate choice to act against it, to prioritize your own inclination over the categorical imperative. He calls it radical evil, not dramatic Hollywood evil, something quieter, the human tendency to put self-interest above principle. Every time, even when you know better. But here's the tension. Kant's framework depends on reason being universal, on every rational being arriving at the same moral conclusions, and that's an assumption, not a proof. Different cultures, different eras, different minds, they don't converge on the same moral truths. They diverge wildly. Hannah Arendt adds another layer entirely. After witnessing the trial of Adolf Eichmann, she coins the phrase, the banality of evil. She argues that the most horrific acts in history weren't committed by monsters. They were committed by bureaucrats, by ordinary people following orders, filling out forms, not thinking. Evil, in her analysis, doesn't require malice. It requires thoughtlessness, the absence of reflection. And that's more terrifying than any demon. So is evil a fact or an opinion? Philosophy hasn't settled it, and it probably can't, because answering the question requires a foundation, some bedrock standard of right and wrong, and every proposed foundation has cracks in it. Reason, God, nature, consensus, all of them contested, all of them incomplete. And yet, we keep using the word. We keep needing it. Because when you witness certain acts, real acts, not hypothetical ones, the idea that evil is just an opinion feels like its own kind of lie. That's the trap. You can't prove evil exists, but you can't live as though it doesn't. Here's a question that should make anyone uncomfortable, not because it's dark, but because it attacks the one thing humans trust most, their own intelligence. What if there are truths out there that the human brain is structurally incapable of understanding? Not because we haven't figured them out yet, but because we literally can't, ever. Immanuel Kant draws the line early. He argues that the human mind doesn't experience reality as it actually is. It experiences reality filtered through built-in mental frameworks, space, time, causality. These aren't features of the world, they're features of human cognition. The world as it truly is, what Kant calls the thing in itself, the noumenon, sits permanently beyond our reach. We don't see reality. We see our mind's translation of reality.
And there's no way to step outside that translation to check if it's accurate. That's not a temporary limitation. That's a permanent architectural constraint. Noam Chomsky picks up something similar from a different angle. He calls it the distinction between problems and mysteries. Problems are things the human mind is equipped to solve, given enough time, enough data, enough effort. Mysteries are different. Mysteries are questions that fall outside our cognitive architecture entirely.
The way a dog will never understand calculus, not because it's lazy, but because its brain wasn't built for it, there may be dimensions of reality that the human brain simply wasn't built to process. And here's the uncomfortable part. We wouldn't even know what we're missing. You can't recognize a blind spot you have no capacity to detect. Colin McGinn pushes this further. He argues that consciousness itself might be one of these mysteries, not because consciousness isn't real, it obviously is, but because the human mind might be constitutionally closed to understanding how it arises from physical matter. He doesn't say the answer doesn't exist. He says we are the wrong kind of minds to find it. The solution could be out there, fully real, fully coherent, and permanently invisible to us. That's a hard pill, especially for a species that built particle accelerators and mapped the human genome. And then there's Gödel. Kurt Gödel doesn't deal in philosophy directly, but his incompleteness theorems land like a bomb in this conversation. He proves, mathematically, that within any consistent formal system, there are true statements that the system itself cannot prove. The system has limits baked into its own structure. Now, if you treat the human mind as a kind of formal system, and that's debatable but not absurd, the implication is staggering. There may be truths that are real, that are logically valid, that we will never be able to demonstrate or even articulate. Some pushback. Daniel Dennett argues that cognitive limits aren't walls, they're challenges. Human beings build tools, telescopes, microscopes, computers, mathematics itself. Each one extends the reach of cognition beyond its biological baseline, so maybe the brain alone can't grasp everything, but the brain plus its instruments? That's a different question. Fair point, but it still assumes the tools we build aren't subject to the same constraints as the minds that built them, and that's an assumption, not a proof. So where does that leave us? In a deeply unsettling place. The possibility, and it is a real, serious, philosophically grounded possibility, that human intelligence has a ceiling. Not a ceiling we haven't reached yet, a ceiling we can't reach, one we might not even be able to see. And if that's true, then the most honest answer to some of the deepest questions in existence might just be we are not equipped to know. That's not defeat, but it is humility of the most brutal kind. The universe shouldn't work. Not like this. Change the gravitational constant by a fraction, a sliver so small it barely registers, and stars never form. Tweak the strong nuclear force just slightly, and atoms fall apart. Adjust the cosmological constant by an almost negligible amount, and the universe either collapses in on itself instantly or expands so fast that nothing, no galaxies, no planets, no life, ever gets a chance to exist. And yet, here we are, talking about it. That's the fine-tuning problem, and it's one of the deepest unsolved puzzles in both physics and philosophy. The physical constants of this universe seem calibrated with absurd precision, not approximately right, not close enough, exact, as if someone or something set the dials. The theists love this argument. Thinkers like William Lane Craig and Robin Collins argue that fine-tuning is powerful evidence for a designer. Collins calls it the strongest argument for theism from the natural sciences. The logic is simple. If the odds of a life-permitting universe arising by chance are astronomically low, and they are, then the most rational explanation is intention, purpose, design. You don't find a watch in the desert and assume the sand assembled it. But the atheists have a counter, and it's a big one. The multiverse hypothesis. Physicists like Max Tegmark and Leonard Susskind argue that our universe isn't the only one. There could be an incomprehensibly vast number of universes, each with different physical constants. Most of them are dead, sterile, hostile to any form of complexity. But in a few, by sheer probability, the numbers line up. And in those rare universes, life emerges. Observers emerge. And those observers look around and say, wow, this place seems made for us. It's not luck, it's selection bias. You can only ask the question in a universe where asking questions is possible. This is what philosophers call the anthropic principle. Brandon Carter formalized it in the 1970s. The weak version just says, the conditions we observe must be compatible with our existence, obviously. The strong version goes further. It suggests that the universe must have properties that allow life to develop at some point. And that must is where the real debate ignites. Because here's the problem with the multiverse. There's no evidence for it, not a shred. It's not testable, not observable, not falsifiable. And philosopher John Leslie points this out sharply. A theory that explains everything by positing an infinite number of unobservable worlds isn't really explaining anything. It's just pushing the mystery back a step. So you're left with a strange choice. Either the universe was designed, which demands a designer you can't prove exists, or the universe is one of trillions, which demands a multiverse you can't prove exists. Both answers require a leap of faith, just in different directions. And some philosophers reject both options entirely. Thinkers like Roger White argue that fine-tuning might not need an explanation at all. Maybe the constants just are what they are. Brute facts. No reason, no purpose, no story behind them. The universe doesn't owe you an explanation. That's a hard pill to swallow. Humans want reasons, patterns, meaning stitched into the fabric of reality. But wanting something doesn't make it true. So the question remains open, wide open. Is this universe the product of cosmic intention, a statistical fluke in an ocean of dead worlds, or just a fact with no explanation whatsoever? Philosophy hasn't cracked it. Physics hasn't either. And the uncomfortable truth is, we might be the kind of creatures who are constitutionally incapable of ever knowing the answer. After 20 questions, this is the one that lingers, the one people don't want to ask out loud, because the answer might sting. Probably not. At least, not in the way most people hope. And that's not a failure. That's philosophy doing exactly what it's supposed to do.
See, there's a fundamental misunderstanding about what philosophy is for. People treat it like a broken machine, something that should be producing answers but keeps malfunctioning. They look at 2.5 millennia of debate and think, you've had all this time and you still can't agree on free will? But that complaint misses the entire point. Philosophy was never an answer factory. It's a pressure test, a stress test for every idea humanity has ever taken for granted. Wittgenstein argues that most philosophical problems aren't real problems at all.
They're confusions born from the misuse of language. We tie ourselves in knots because our words trick us into asking questions that don't actually have the shape of a question. What is the meaning of life? Sounds like it should have an answer the way "what is the capital of France" does, but it doesn't. And Wittgenstein warns that failing to see that distinction is where most of the suffering begins. Karl Popper takes a different position. He argues that progress in philosophy is real. It's just not the kind of progress people recognize. Philosophy doesn't solve problems by settling them once and for all.
It solves them by refining the questions, by stripping away bad assumptions, by making the next generation's thinking sharper than the last. The questions evolve. That is the progress. But not everyone's that optimistic. Colin McGinn, a contemporary philosopher, puts forward what he calls Mysterianism. His argument is blunt. Some problems, particularly consciousness and free will, may be permanently beyond human cognitive reach, not because the answers don't exist, but because our brains simply aren't built to grasp them. The way a dog can't understand calculus, humans might be constitutionally incapable of resolving certain metaphysical questions. It's a humbling claim, and an uncomfortable one, because it suggests there are hard ceilings on what we can ever know. So if these questions won't be solved, why keep asking them? Because the asking changes you. That's not a motivational slogan. That's an observable fact. Every major leap in human civilization, in science, politics, ethics, law, was preceded by someone refusing to accept the existing answers, someone pushing back, someone saying, "But why?" The abolition of slavery didn't start with a policy paper. It started with a philosophical argument about personhood. Democracy didn't fall from the sky. It was built on centuries of messy, unresolved debates about justice, rights, and authority. Socrates understood this better than anyone. He argues, through every dialogue Plato records, that the unexamined life is not worth living. Not because examination gives you a final answer, but because the act of examination is what separates a conscious human being from someone just sleepwalking through existence. He never claimed to have the truth. He claimed to be the only one honest enough to admit he didn't. And that honesty, that's the real legacy of these 20 questions. They don't give you closure. They give you clarity about just how much you don't know. And in a world drowning in false certainty, where everyone has an opinion and nobody has a justification, that kind of intellectual humility isn't just rare, it's dangerous, in the best possible way. These questions won't be answered, but they'll keep doing what they've always done, forcing anyone brave enough to sit with them to think harder, see clearer, and settle for less comfortable truths. That's not a bug. That's the whole design.